Hi, this is Mr. P with lesson number 13 on the of the Black Freedom Struggle, where we'll focus on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. You might be familiar with the traditional uh, look at the "I Have a Dream" speech at this march. I want to highlight some pieces that get overlooked and take a more critical stance in our study of this march in 1963. So let's get started. I'll disappear and make this full screen. All right. So uh, I want to highlight three particular things: the overlooked role of Bayard Rustin, the ways in which the Kennedy administration co-opted the march, and Malcolm X's criticisms. So first, just want to remind you, the march is designed to pressure Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill proposed by President Kennedy, which had been proposed after the Birmingham campaign in June, after the Birmingham campaign, when there were riots from the Black community that ultimately put a lot of pressure on the federal government. And those riots were not part of the intentional strategy in the campaign, which is important to note. They were just everyday people expressing their anger and frustration with systemic racism. So let's look at Bayard Rustin. He's the deputy director, not the official director. A. Philip Randolph, who was president of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, was the official director. Why? Well, let's look at Roy Wilkins' quote from the NAACP, one of the big six in the coalition supporting this march. The big six referring to these six major civil rights organizations led by men: Congress of Racial Equality, Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, NAACP, these organizations. SNCC as well. And so Roy Wilkins says, "I don't want you leading that march on Washington because you know I don't give a damn about what they say, but publicly I don't want to have to defend the draft dodging. I know you're a Quaker, but that's not what I'll have to defend. I'll have to defend draft dodging. I'll have to defend promiscuity. The question is, Governor, going to be homosexuality? It's going to be promiscuity, and I can't defend that. And the fact is that you were a member of the Young Communist League, and I don't care what they say, I can't defend that." So Bayard Rustin, as a gay pacifist who did not draft dodge, he was a conscientious objector, and who's a gay man who's been arrested and targeted for that, and who at one point joined the Communist League, was vulnerable to criticism both within the civil rights movement and from outsiders and the federal government. For this reason, he was not made the face of the march, even though he was the principal strategist and organizer behind the march. Which had goals, by the way, of not just passing the civil rights bill, but they also were talking specifically about economic justice and economic freedom. Jobs were a crucial part in the demands. All right, so let's look at Bayard Rustin in more detail, and then we'll get to the march in more detail. Bayard Rustin was born outside of Philadelphia as a Quaker, so he had not just a belief in nonviolent strategy, but a deep belief in the moral responsibility to adhere to nonviolent strategy. So that made him a pacifist, specifically. And that is why he conscientiously objected to being drafted into World War II. And he was arrested for that, served over a year in prison, and even served on a chain gang. Coming out of that, he joined the Communist Party, in part because the Communist Party had an intentional civil rights and Black equality stance. They weren't affirming of the queer community, but they did attract Black members because, at a time when the federal government was opposing civil rights, and state governments to a greater degree were opposing civil rights, in the South in particular, but also to some degree in the North, the Communist Party was an attractive spot for some Black folks like Bayard Rustin. He went to India, traveled to India to learn civil disobedience. That made him quite valuable to Dr. King later on. Later on, he's arrested in 1953 in California for having sex in a car with another man. There were promiscuity laws that specifically targeted gay people at this time in the 1950s. So he was among those who was arrested for that kind of charge. He ends up becoming an advisor for Dr. King on the Montgomery bus boycotts, which meant him being a central role in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so by 1960, when the movement and the campaign or the conference are protesting the Democratic National Convention to try and get them to take a stronger civil rights stance, the Democratic Party sends Black Representative Adam Clayton Powell to tell King and the SCLC to basically remove to remove the protest, or they will spread rumors that Bayard Rustin and King were lovers. And so King wanted to kind of withdraw the protest to avoid that rumor being spread. He did not stand up for Bayard in that moment, but apparently his speechwriter did, and told Clayton Powell that they would spread news in the press about his many mistresses if he said anything about Bayard Rustin. So the protest had initially been called off, but they continued part of it. By 1963, with the march, the movement did not want him to be the face. But his skills were so valuable that they couldn't not include him. He was that valuable. There were criticisms that were launched against him by the Black Power movement. Things like he didn't take a strong enough stance against the Vietnam War, for example, and he also took a stance with respect to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and during Freedom Summer that folks felt was too compromising. That'll be actually a focus of the next video. He goes on to fight for gay rights during the gay rights liberation movement and during the AIDS crisis, fights for more funding for AIDS research. He ends up falling in love with Walter Nagel, and they are unable to marry. So Bayard Rustin ends up adopting Walter Nagel to get, other rights and legal protections. For example, if somebody died and they left, inheritance to their partner, if they were married, a straight couple married at the time, they would pay a very small percentage tax. If they were not married, they would have to pay a high tax. So gay people were excluded from certain benefits like that, hospital visitations, and a whole host of other benefits. And so the one way available to gay couples at the time, before marriage equality in 2013, was to adopt each other. Many, many, many gay couples had ended up adopting each other as a result. The last piece I want to highlight here is, and you can read more about that here below, the last piece I want to highlight here is that he did get recognized by President Obama with the Medal of Freedom, the Presidential Medal of Freedom later in recent years during the Obama presidency. Now we're ready to move on to a look at the march. So Kennedy, viewed as a passive ally, someone hesitant, dragging their feet, not wanting to support civil rights, but able to do so if there's enough pressure put on him. And with the march, he was scared of too large and too radical of a march in DC. So he tells his advisors, if we can't stop it, we'll run the damn thing. And he co-opts the march. He meets with organizers to establish criteria that they agree to. The date needs to be a Wednesday, not a weekend. People are working Wednesday. Not as many people will show up. Organizers would have to intentionally try to attract white people. Demonstrators had to encourage people to had to be encouraged to dress conservatively, suits and ties and dresses, arrive in the morning, depart on the same day, not stay overnight. That was concerning for him, and that there would be a short walk with speeches at the end, no further radical actions. And so he effectively co-opts the march. There's those who resist this. John Lewis of SNCC originally wrote in his speech the following: in good conscience, we cannot support the administration's civil rights bill. Remember, the whole design of the march was to try and get the civil rights bill passed. And John Lewis criticizes that. He says it's too little, too late. There's not one thing in the bill that will protect our people from police brutality. So this is an important moment to pause and consider. To what extent did nonviolent action help protect people from police brutality? John Lewis here criticizes the bill for this reason. Mr. Kennedy is trying to take the revolution out of the street and put it in the courts. We will march through the South, through the heart of Dixie, the way Sherman did. Remember, Sherman's the guy behind the initial land redistribution to Black folks with Special Order Number 15 right at the end of the Civil War. And we shall pursue our own scorched earth policy and burn Jim Crow to the ground. And he adds, nonviolently. So he's not advocating for violence here. He's advocating for a more radical, militant, nonviolent stance, and that's what John Lewis is doing here. But he was asked to, and SNCC was asked to edit the speech, and he did not deliver this section of the speech. Malcolm X criticizes the march. So here's where I want you to pause. If you didn't attend class, because in class you listen to this, go to this YouTube link and listen to the 8-minute speech he gives criticizing the march. And he lists a host of criticisms. He talks about how it's the Birmingham riots that led to Kennedy pursuing the civil rights legislation. He discusses how every day Black people are talking about marching on Washington to get them to pressure and implement wider spread civil and political rights, economic rights, jobs, etc. And he highlights how everyday people wanted to take action at the airport in DC and prevent flights from taking off. They were talking about radical actions, and Malcolm X criticizes the Big Six, in particular Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, who is not considered one of the Big Six, but Bayard Rustin's role, Dr. King's role in meeting with Kennedy and allowing Kennedy to co-opt the movement. And he criticizes them and says they're not helping the movement, actually. And so pay attention to the criticism he's delivering here from outside the movement, and the way that funding works, and the role of money, and the role of these compromises, and the priority he gives to everyday Black people and with revolutionary desires, and the ways in which he argues the movement is taking that out. So that's something to pay attention to here. Congress initially did not pass the Civil Rights Bill because of the march. It wasn't enough pressure. JFK was assassinated, and Johnson, his vice president who becomes president after the assassination, ends up pushing the bill to pass. And many would argue that it's JFK's assassination that paves the way for the bill to pass. And a lot of, some historians are obsessed with this kind of Johnson treatment. You'll notice here how he gets up close and personal with many of these Southern white politicians in Congress who he pressures to pass the Civil Rights Bill. So it's, the Johnson treatment's an interesting and sort of interesting piece to look at, but it is important to not overlook what led to this, right? That the bill is proposed because of the Birmingham riots and the increasing militancy on the part of Black people that JFK was fearful of, and that gets the ball rolling. So the act outlaws discrimination. It does get passed, and it outlaws discrimination in all public places. It outlaws discrimination by employers based on race, gender, religion, and national origin. Take note how many different groups, identity groups, are benefiting from this. One criticism of the act is even though it mentions voting rights the requirement should be the same for all people, it's not strong enough to enforce that, which is why Freedom Summer and Selma in our next two videos will become important to fight for voting rights. But it does outlaw discrimination. But the law is not enough, right? So people have to take them to, this is the actual language of the bill. So they actually have to take them to court. One of those first cases is the Katzenbach v. McClung case in 1964. In Birmingham, Alabama, the owner of Ollie's Barbecue refused to serve Blacks, violating the Civil Rights Act. And it's important to mention that the act is able to pursue or able to establish anti-discrimination policy on the part of private businesses, because those businesses use things like food, which are bought through interstate commerce. And that goes back to the Commerce Clause, where federal government is able to pass laws that regulate interstate business, interstate trade, interstate commerce. And so the question is, does the restaurant's refusal, to serve Blacks burden interstate commerce to the extent that Congress can legitimately prohibit such a discrimination? And the Supreme Court upholds the Civil Rights Act, and this begins the process of actually desegregating in private businesses, not just on public accommodations, not just on government-run things, but also on public accommodations, private businesses that are public accommodations for the general public. All right. So next video we'll discuss Freedom Summer, and the video after that, Selma. So we're moving more deeply into voting rights and political power. All right. Come back for that.